The first, most basic tenet of flood risk wisdom is actually very old. It probably goes all the way back to when humans were looking for that optimal cave. The basic tenet is flood exposure is location specific. Your risk depends first and foremost on the type or types of flooding your property is exposed to and the specific way it is exposed. Here's a very old proverb. A wise man built his house on the rock, the rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundations on the rock. A foolish man built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Any idea who told it? It actually comes from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Back in those days, living in marginal communities, his audience would have understood this most basic flood risk wisdom about location, location, location. Basic wise versus foolish house building was really crucial to everyone's well-being back then. So Jesus used it as a parable for another type of building that he was preaching about. It is important to note that there are really four types of flooding that we can be exposed to. The first, called flash flooding, is from locally intense rainfall that runs off and rapidly fills up neighborhood low spots. We've all probably tried driving through such low spots. Unfortunately, some folks have homes that are in topographic bowls where runoff ponds and which don't drain well. Crucially, you might think you are risk-free, but in fact, an extreme sustained downpour might put a little water in your house, depending on how it's built and how your and your neighbor's lots drain. And an inch or two of flooding in most homes will cause tens of thousands of dollars of damage. The second type of exposure is what hydrologists call a river flood wave. A river flood wave starts upstream with precipitation or melting snow in the higher parts of the watershed and grows with tributary inflows. These days, the National Weather Service forecasts the rise and fall of flood waves pretty accurately for just about every major stream in the country. Along the lower downstream parts of rivers and streams, flood waves can reach restrictions which can cause flows to slow down drastically, rise, and overflow into surrounding areas. Important natural restrictions include narrowing of floodplains, slope reductions, and high downstream water levels, such as high tide or storm surge at the coast. Important artificial restrictions include, of course, dams and weirs, but also undersized bridges and culverts for roads crossing through floodplains, as well as filling of floodplains. Any backing up of flood flow usually affects lower tributaries and can even result in a reverse of flow up the tributary. This figure illustrates the peak flood profile along a stream that is flowing backwards. Note how in this case several bridge obstructions have caused a series of restrictions in the backwater flow. The fourth type of flood exposure occurs primarily along ocean coasts and includes extreme tides and wind-driven surges. Wind-driven tilting also occurs in large inland lakes such as Okeechobee, the Great Salt Lake, and the Great Lakes. In addition to four types of flood exposure, there have long been three ways to describe flood exposure, all measuring the vertical level of flooding above something. In the U.S., we of course measure flood levels in feet. The vertical measurement we all usually talk about is flood height, the flood level above the ground. When we're concerned about flood damage, we often talk about flood depth, the flood level above the lowest floor, usually a concrete slab or joist. The third measurement is from a standard vertical reference point, or datum, and is called flood elevation. Across large areas, U.S. hydrologists typically prefer to use a single nationwide standard reference. This single reference is called the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. You can think of NAVD88 as a single approximate mean sea level for the whole continent, although mean sea level actually varies a bit. In some areas where there is a nearby river or tide gauge, flood elevation may be referenced to a point on the gauge. Most hydrologists prefer to convert these gauge datums to NAVD88. As these photos show, flood elevation, height, and depth can change drastically over a very short distance. Therefore, potential exposure to the four types of flooding needs to be considered on the basis of each and every individual property. Let me say that again. Flood exposure needs to be considered on the basis of each and every individual property. And this includes by property owners, renters, managers, brokers, investors, lenders, and government regulators and planners. To sum up, being wise about individual property flood exposure has been common sense for more than 2,000 years. Unfortunately today, many of us are not as wise about this most basic flood risk tenet as our ancestors were. In the next video, we'll examine 21st century wisdom regarding flood hazard. Please don't hesitate to email, text, or call me with comments and questions.